the slides are not shifting. Okay, so I'll be able to make some alterations if that's the case. Should I, is the PPT visible?
Yes, yes, ma'am. It's visible.
Thank you so much. So, as you would have seen the brochure, the session for today is about the rudiments of research. In specific, we will be looking at review of literature, since that's a part of every type of research and every subject that you do. Review of literature is inevitable. So I thought we will be looking at the review of literature, before which we'll have a brief introduction. Right. So how is research different from any other person's sense of inquiry or sense of interest to find out something, inquisitiveness? How is research different from that? Most of us have seen people asking very pertinent questions for which they try to find answers. You have in the meantime, you have people who invent things. There are also people who inquire and then they come up with new methods of doing something or finding something. And research is an advanced level of people just finding solutions or answers. So how does research stand apart from man's general urge to ask questions, inquire, and find solutions? So there is, as you read the first line, we are basically exposed to experiences, reasoning, and then you're also exposed to
Ma'am, can you
research.
change the slide?
Is the slides visible to you all?
Yes, it's visible, but the shifting of slides is not visible.
Can I do one thing? Can I email the PPT to you?
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
All right, just give me a minute. That will take a minute for me.
Okay, okay.
Just give me a minute.
It's okay even if you WhatsApp me, ma'am. Anything is fine.
All right, all right. I think it's easier for me when I do it from laptop. Just give me a minute. I'll
Yes,
share
ma'am.
the slide. Email ID, please.
Ma'am, shall I WhatsApp?
Yes, please do. Please do.
Yes, ma'am. Set.
Okay. Yes, it has been sent. Ma'am, I have sent it. Just please check and
Yes,
let me
ma'am.
know.
Okay.
All right, all right. So I have stopped sharing.
Yes, ma'am. I got it.
All right. Could you please share the second slide, please?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Second slide, please.
Ma'am, 2 minutes, ma'am.
Yes, yes. All right. So in the meantime, I can just brief you about, since it's an introduction. So what it says is that lay people do have inquisitiveness, they do have questions, they do keep asking, but then there is no empirically testing of it. So that is what
Ma'am,
gives
your
a firm
camera.
basis.
Sorry, ma'am. Your camera is off.
All
The
right.
video is turned off.
Now is it all right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So there is a firm empirical testing that is done that helps you to have a firm basis. Yes, what I'm saying is right. So we test it, and it happens without any personal bias at the same time, because it is controlled by a system. There is a system that functions, and that system is already set. So whether I would like to choose to vouch for something or no is irrelevant for me as a researcher, because there is an already set mechanism that makes sure that there is no personal bias. All right.
Participants kindly mute. Sorry, ma'am. Daryl, ma'am, can you mute all? Daryl, ma'am, kindly unmute the speaker.
Okay, I think I have unmuted myself. All right. So, a researcher cannot intervene and change data. He cannot intervene, ethically speaking, and a researcher cannot change data, even sometimes if it is not pleasing. And I think that's what sets man's inquiry or man's inquisitiveness apart from research. Because probably if I'm inquisitive as an individual, I might find responses, but then I might choose to interpret it in the way that I like it. Okay, but in research that is not a possibility. Whether I like it or no, what data I get, I will have to put it forward. And also there is a huge research body that is observing us in the process of the research, and that is what gives us the help as well. So sometimes even if we tend to go a little way apart, there is a whole research body and academia that follows us and supports us, and that is what sets research apart. And that's why I put this quote here: research is a combination of both experience and reasoning, and must be regarded as the most successful approach to the discovery of truth. So many people, usually, if you see, they would choose their topic of research based on their experience, based on what they have seen, based on the difficulties that they have faced, or some sort of a struggles that they've been through. To find solutions for that is what research is. Research is actually a social work. You are doing something towards society, and that's why most of the time when we do research, they ask, what is your research contributing to society? And that is what the response is most of the time. It should be, otherwise it is pointless. Ma'am, could you turn to the fourth slide, please? All right. So now we'll be looking at perceptions of research. Now, when we talk about perceptions of research, what I will be talking to you here is how have different authors and different researchers looked at research. Okay. So if you look at it in the first place, it talks about a partnership between a researcher and participants. Most of the time, when it comes to research, we are always of the understanding that we are the sole owners, the sole proprietors of the research, and our participants are merely candidates for testing. Especially if you look at quantitative research, wherein we are doing an intervention, we most of the time look at participants as being at the beck and call of a researcher. But here, this particular author Delane says it's a partnership between a researcher and a participant, because it is a coalition wherein I receive from you and I also contribute from you. And both, it is equally the responsibility of the researcher as well as the participants to shape the research. Most of the time we don't realize that a research will never be a product if there are no participants, and therefore there is this mutual respect that exists between a researcher and a participant when it comes to research. It also talks about how Gills and Aldred says research must lead to change and improvement. If you remember previously, we spoke about how research is a contribution to society. So whenever we choose any topic for research, especially if you're looking for sponsorships or government aiding, then they will definitely ask you, what is the social cause of your research? How is it going to help a particular society? Is it going to serve a larger community or a smaller community? So every time, whenever we endeavor in any research, if it's not going to lead or influence or or address a particular community and a change to that particular group of people, then I think we need to rethink, is my research really going to be a contribution to society? Because if it isn't, then it is not research, it is just doing something that already exists. There's also one important thing. As I said previously, participants and researchers are mutually benefited. But we also fail to realize that, as you see the third point, when we do intervene, we are putting at risk the participants, especially in cases wherein we probably have intervention studies with school children, okay, or probably with people who work in small scale industries. I'm giving you examples wherein they don't have much control over the situation. They are a participant, but they don't know the authority that they exert in that particular situation, and they have a possibility of being exploited for data, their personal information being given away. All of these are also an integral part which we need to consider. So in research, we cannot forego understanding and valuing the sentiments of our participants. The fourth and the last point is solidarity. Okay, so if you look at it, it's very a little difficult to accept, but also we have to understand it more. As I said before, why do I take a particular point of research? Because I have faced certain challenges, I have faced certain difficulties in that given field, and I think that my research will contribute towards what I am looking forward to. But here, what this particular researcher talks about is, it's not necessary that always I will have a, an identity with my participants, because probably I might belong to where I am coming from, and my participants might be part of where I have come from. But it's a very unrealistic optimism, as it says here, because maybe I share the same similarities. Maybe some variables are similar, but not all variables are similar. And maybe I have the privilege of certain leverages. For example, I might have come from a particular community, but now my economic status might be different. I might come from a particular community, but my education background now is different. I might have come from a particular community, but my exposure now is different. So that solidarity that I claim to have with my group of participants, with my group that I'm testing on, I might say that I am similar to them, I'm same with them, but not necessarily. There might be a few differences, and I might be blind to understanding and seeing that. So these are all different perceptions of what research has been looked upon. And that is why we come to the idea of ethics of research. When you look at what is ethics of research, it's very, very important, especially in today's context. When you look at the idea of ethics, most of the time we're worried about the end, and we're not worried about the process. So many times we do certain researches, or we see certain researches wherein we question were the participants aware of them being researched upon, were the participants willing to be a part of this research. How many of us we have conducted research in classes, but we have never got a consent form from our participants? So this ethics of research is something that is become a very important part of the recent past, especially for us, because we become more aware, especially if you look at social sciences. um, Not so much see people worrying about it in arts or humanities, but in social sciences it has always been a very integral part, and it is now foraying into language and literature. So we always have to receive the consent of our participants, whether they know what they are getting into. For example, let's say we are testing a group of students to check their vocabulary. We need to let the children know that we are testing them for their vocabulary. If I'm not going to tell them that you're being tested and your results have been taken, then it is, if in fact, violation of ethics. So it's very important that you let them know, because sometimes it could be an invasion of their privacy. For example, when you receive data based on their social background, it could be an invasion of their privacy if they have not had a consent form to sign for you. And also, going on to the second point, there are certain times wherein the dignity of an individual is more important. Okay, and we have to learn to compensate our research outcome based on whether how far we take it. So sometimes in research, if sometimes the researcher feels that the dignity of the individuals in the given research is not going to be safe, then we have to learn to compensate. Human values come higher. And I think we should have the gumption to mention that in our research as well. Most of the time, we give them a blind side and then we just mention whatever has been successful. But sometimes it is not as successful simply because we have put human values as the forefront. And sometimes one of our objectives or one of our research questions might go negative because of that, and it is totally normal. We should be able to accept it and be able to mention it in our research that this particular research question has not been answered, or this particular research objective has not been achieved, or hypothesis has not been achieved for these given reasons. And I think the research community will actually respect when we do make a mention of these aspects. The next one is the second and the third point are similar to each other. Going on to the fourth point, okay. Um, we have to also mention in this consent form that I told you. Most of the time, we just say this is a test that we are going to conduct, and are you willing to be a part of it? But I think what will be more convincing as a researcher that will help us to move forward is if you mention the benefits that the candidate would get being an integral part of this research. For example, let's say you're teaching them certain life skills as part of your research. It would be nice if we mention that in our consent form, that these are the skills that you would be learning at the end of this program, or these are the benefits that you would receive by spending so many hours as part of this research. So that would help them to realize the larger picture. Therefore, I think ethics is not only about protecting the candidate who's involved in the research, but it's also about helping them understand the benefits of being an integral part of it. Because I don't think any research will not have anything to contribute to society, because our entire aim is to change society for a better tomorrow. So it is important that we mention these potential benefits. In fact, I have seen quite a few consent forms, and I have barely seen any forms that talk about the benefits that a candidate would receive by being a part of this research. And I think the minute we integrate that as part of our ethics form, I think it would help many more people to volunteer to be a part of our research community. And the last one, I think I already spoke about it, is to question whether the end is justified by the way that we have got it. In simple ways, simple means what I go to say is, when you reflect back on your result, when you look at the process that you've been through, will you be happy? Yes, this is a research that I have done. I have done everything right. And people who are involved in my research have also benefited out of it. If that is the case, then it's a very good research. Next slide, ma'am, please. I think it's the sixth slide. Yes. So these are all mere introductions. We'll go on to the review of literature very soon. So planning research. So planning of your research is very, very important. Most of the time, we have an idea of what the topic is, and then we go on to do the research. And then we realize that there is no framework that is set in place. So always when you arrive at a topic, you decide on a topic, when you want to conduct a particular research, it's better that you set down for yourself the nitty gritty of what the research is going to be, a coherent flow chart, a framework that will help you understand this is how my research is going to be. And it might change a little bit, but that you can accommodate. But if you're going to just dive into it with no pre-plan, no framework whatsoever, then it could cause a lot of issues. Because if you look at the first line, you'll understand. To change the rules of the game midstream is going to spell disaster. Because it's like you planning a recipe. You need to know what you are cooking. You need to know the ingredients. If you're just going to throw in random items as you go in the process, you might get something. I'm not saying you will not get, you will get something. But what are you going to call it? That is the question. And what are you going to reflect on? Or will you remember the process? Will you be able to retell the story to someone? Will people be able to accept it as ethical? Those are the questions that you will have to reflect on. So always have a research framework properly framed before you even endeavor in it. Now, if you look at the third point, you'll see that your research can be in two phases. Actually, it is not in two phases. If you ask me, one leads to the other. These are two phases that everyone goes through when you're planning for research. And I think everyone should go, because it's a very organic process. The first is the divergent phase. If you look at the divergent phase, you will have a whole array of options that will come to you as a researcher. If you all reflect when you started research, probably the first few months of your research, when you were drafting your research proposal, or right after your research proposal got accepted, and then your guide wants to discuss it with you, the kind of changes that goes through in your research, you from one point you will have 10 points. It's only then you will realize, oh my god, my research topic has so much of potential. And then they will open to you a whole plethora of subtopics that will confuse you. And that is what you call as the divergent phase. It's a very natural phase, and I think all of us should go through that phase. And then you will automatically move into what you call as the convergent phase. The convergent phase is actually the most deciding phase of research, wherein you will see and be able to select and unselect the possibilities of the research options that you have. And you will realize that some are workable for you, some are not workable for you, simply because of the limitations and delimitations that you have, and because of certain issues that you have with the topic of research, etc. And that is when you will converge into an actually working paper, which will help you to implement your research. So all of us should actually go through the divergent and the convergent phase of our research. And most of us think research is the end of it. What most of us don't realize is when you place your PhD and you give in your viva voce, that is the beginning of your research. Your viva voce or your PhD was the first research that you ever embarked upon, and therefore you do not set that as the end of your research. That should be something that propels you to do something further. All right. This I just thought would be helpful for those who are looking for research. If you're looking at a framework that you are initiating your research upon, these are the aspects that you should be looking into. And if you get these aspects into place, I think it will help us solve a lot of issues that will further arise when we do get into research. I'll not spend much time on this. Um, Ma'am, could you turn to the eighth slide, please? All right. Yes, not that one, ma'am. Eighth slide. This is the seventh slide. Eighth slide. Okay. There are some extra slides that I put, but I don't think we'll be able to work through it. So we'll just work with what is beneficial for us. So these are the most probable good questions that you could ever reflect upon before you start your research. Okay. So many of the times we have a research topic, but then we don't know how viable our research topic is. We don't know whether what we plan for will really be acceptable, or when I look back on it 10 years hence, will it be something that will still be relevant, because relevant is something that's most important in research. So when you plan for research, it's always good to ask yourself, who's going to benefit from this research? Is there a community that is going to benefit from this? If not, then it's best that you rethink your research. Second one, who is going to be the recipients? Who is going to be the possible people who will be able to guide this research and help this research and make it something that is productive? Okay, that is also important, because that community is what upholds research and pushes it forward. Then what are the aims and purposes of the research? These are, right, your objectives and research questions. Next, what are the main priorities and constraints? Most of the time we look at priorities, but we don't look at constraints. Only after we start the research, we have an epiphany that these are the constraints of our research. So actually it's good that you have a kind of you have a written document wherein you put down the pros and the cons, and then you look at what are all the difficulties that you will face in this research, and then see whether you will be able to still pursue this research, or how can you overcome certain challenges that you face. Next question, very important. We like to conduct the research, but we don't know how we're going to gather that data, especially if it is data that is very difficult to collect, like words that are spoken, okay, or probably in paralinguistics. How is that is data to be collected? We have to decide upon the tools that we are going to use. Those are very, very important, because even me as a researcher, when I was doing my PhD, the biggest challenge that I faced was the tool. Well, how am I going to gather this information? How am I going to document it? How am I going to interpret it? The idea was nice. I'm going to work on this group. I'm going to do this. I'm going to bring about a change. But in the process, how am I going to document it? How am I going to collect the data? So always think about that. What are going to be your tools? What I have also not mentioned here is what are the variables that I will be working with. Sometimes we have one idea, but that idea is very overarching. It's a bird's eye view. So always when we embark upon research, we also need to think what are the specific variables that I'm going to work with. What are the variables that I'm going to say that these aspects have brought about a change in me. Okay. The next one is ethical issues that we have already spoken about. So I'm not going to look at it. And what are the resources that are required for the research? Sometimes we embark on the research. We might have planned only for the physical material, but then there are also other aspects to it. Only when you get into it, you will have so many. When I talk about administrative, it is getting permission from many government bodies. Okay, it is about your physically being able to move to a particular place and do a certain research. Sometimes it's humanly not possible to do research in certain areas for certain people. So look at all the resources, whether you will be able to collect it, get it, work with it. What are all the, that is why I said look at how your data is, look at how your constraints are. All these are interrelated. Okay, is access realistic? That is very very important. When I say access, it's not access just to your sample, it's also access to your data, access to the material that you're going to work upon, accessibility to implement it as well. Sometimes we have very very utopian ideas of how we would like our research to be, but when you get down to it realistically, it's not as easy as we imagined it to be. And I remember one of my candidates, um, thank God she did a pilot study. So the ideas that we had framed for was wonderful. She went forward, she conducted a pilot study on a small group of students, and the next day she called me and she said, I think I need to rethink everything that I thought was easy. Everything about the research that I thought is easily implementable is actually not implementable. So it was very simple actually. When you look at it in the written form, when we discussed it, it looked very easy to implement. But when she went there on the field and then when she implemented it, she was telling me of all the challenges and all the hurdles that she had to face. And that is what is accessing something in a very realistic manner. And that's why if you look at it, I would have mentioned previously, always it's very, very good to do a pilot. Whatever you intend to do, especially for intervention studies, for qualitative, quantitative data, always have a pilot study. Look at how it is working, then make your changes and then go forward. Most of the time in research, we see students don't do a pilot study. They just go for the intervention, they show the data, and then they say, we did a pilot study. So actually, it would have been better if those candidates had done a pilot study, because the research would be much more better. The results would have been much more easier. Okay, and the last one is time scales and time frames. I think all of us know that we all have time restraints, and I think for all those who did COVID PhDs, it would have been a Herculean task. Now, why did I talk about all of this? Because you're coming down to one very very important thing, that is framing your research questions. Research questions are very very pivotal, because they will actually decide what I'm going to tell you next, and that is about your review of literature. So what are these research questions? Why are they so important? The reason is, when we frame research questions, most of the time we have questions, but we don't see whether those research questions are measurable, whether I'll be able to provide an answer for that question. That is most important. It the same lies with our research objectives as well. We frame research objectives, we frame research questions, but are we able to respond to those research questions and research objectives when we do our analysis? That is what you should see. Look at it in the reflection. See whether my research will provide answers for this question. Am I doing an experiment that will give me answers for these questions? If not, it's not that your questions are wrong. You just need to reframe your questions to answer your questions. Okay, so that is very important. Next thing is being specific. Sometimes our research questions are there, it's overarching, and it overarches the entire analysis. Then it becomes just one research question. So try to break it down into specificity so that you answer sections of your research, and therefore each section of your analysis is answered in your research questions. So most of the time people do not have variables in their research questions. Most of the time people do not address the methodology that they are going to use. Most of the time they don't address the theoretical framework that they have. So all of these could be actually addressed in your research questions, wherein when the reviewer reads our work, they're like, okay, fine, this is all being responded to in the research questions. So you actually, you are God in that place. You get to design something and have questions that answer it. The best thing that we could do is look at our work in reflection, and that helps a lot. The next one is the fourth one, looking at it as being investigative. Okay, investigative is always important for research, and therefore am I able to produce results, concrete results, or abstract results. Abstract results will not really work for research. If I have vague responses, probably, mostly, most, those are not responses that are required for a research question. So research questions should be very, very specific and narrow. Try to frame them accordingly. Most of the time people, the minute they don't have a response for their research questions, they just delete it, they do away with it. But what I would always suggest is reframe your research questions so that you are able to achieve it towards the end. And the best way is to break it down into the nitty gritty of what your research is, and it will obviously answer your research questions. We'll not look at hypothesis testing because I'm already running out of time. um, Kartika ma'am, could you move to slide 12? That will be helpful. Yes, I think, yeah, I think that's the slide. No, the previous slide. Why do a literature review? Previous slide. Yes, why do a literature review? Thank you so much. So, literature review, as I said, is something that all subjects, all streams will do. And therefore, it is very, very important because it actually sets the stronghold for you to establish yourself as a good researcher. Because people can do experiments, they can write answers, they can write results, but what do they know about their research? Are they sitting it on something that is properly researched in the history? That is very important. So literature review actually establishes your research work in a very pivotal position. Most of the time people don't realize how important it is. Actually, through your research, a review of literature, you can actually answer your research objectives. You can establish the prominence of your research, the need for your research through your literature review. So anyone who thinks we can skip the literature review, or that's just a formality, will be very sadly disappointed to know that the literature review is actually very important. And today you have research articles that don't have literature review only in one section. We have it as a coherent part of every part of your research papers. So literature review, we are going to look at why. Look at the first point. Okay, it helps you to understand your work among the body of other research works. For example, now let's say you're going to study about the effects of COVID on high school students. Unless I do a proper literature review, will I know whether anyone else has done that particular research? If someone else has done it, then my literature review will tell me that I am doing an already done research. Or it will help me to understand how further I can narrow down and make mine very unique from the rest. So it helps me to set my work in a body of other works that are probably already existent. Okay. Another one is describe the relationship of each work to the others under consideration. The idea is there'll be very similar research works. And most of the time, if we don't do a proper literature review, we'll think all of them are same. But if in fact you do a proper literature review, you will see that there are differences. There are small nitty-gritty differences, and there are gaps which actually becomes your literature review and your gap for the need for the study. So literature review actually helps you to establish the need for the study. Through your answering your research objectives, you actually come to a place wherein you say, therefore I need a literature review because all these articles have done A research, B research, C research, but D research has not been done, and therefore there is a gap and I am going to address that. Okay. You're also going to find new ways to interpret research. When you talk about new ways to interpret research, when you read different research works, you will see how each person perceives a particular idea from a different lens. And there are intersection of lenses as well, I will not say no, but then you get to interpret your work through a new perspective, through a new lens, and that is very important, rather than just repeating. Next is, I already mentioned you, reveal any gaps. Another one is resolve conflict. When you talk about resolve conflict, sometimes people will take research works that are open to deliberation. There will be works that are highly debated upon, and therefore when you take those kind of works, the literature review actually helps you to really find out whether those controversies in that particular area of study really exist, and if they exist, how valid they are, and does my work have any scope in it. For example, if you look at probably people who do research probably on the third gender, okay, they will find very controversial review of literature. Some might be supporting, some might not be supporting, some might be on the fence. So, how does my work establish itself in that particular context? These are very controversial topics in very, very different contexts. So, it helps me to establish my work. The next one is I will not be repeating someone else's research. Most of the time, you will see some people have done wonderful research, but that has already been done. The reason is they've never read works, they've never read reviews to know what it is. So it's very important to do a proper literature review, not to redo someone else's research work and have a futile 3 years of research. The next one is you are going to establish the prominence of your research. Okay, that is very important, as I said. By answering your research objectives, by reading a lot of work, you will therefore highlight why your work is more important than all these already done works. And most of the time, people I see have noticed, and I have also done it as a researcher, we use literature review to fill in the pages if we feel that the pages are less. But what we don't realize is it's a very, very systematic scaffolding of our knowledge of the subject. And if any reviewer is to just read our review of literature, they will know how much we know of the topic and how much we don't know of the topic. How many times we have gone to an doctoral committee meeting and told the student, show me your review of literature, show me your references. The entire purpose of it is to see whether the student has really read, does she or he know what he or she is talking about. So that is very important. Now, what does this review of literature has to contain? So these are very, very important. When you look at your review of literature, first and foremost, you must provide an overview of the area of your study. Whatever your area of study is, you know, right? Don't go to the specific, but the larger. For example, if you look at English language teaching, you might be looking at one particular variable, but you also have to give an overview of what language is in an Indian context, what teaching is in an Indian context, and then get down to your narrow area. Next is objectives of the literature review. This is actually a very smart way to do your literature review, wherein you have your objectives very clearly established for your research, and then you pick literature review to answer those research objectives. Sometimes they answer, sometimes they leave a gap, and that is beneficial for you. Okay, but always it's very easy if you work this way, when you establish your research objectives and then work with the literature review to answer each of your research objectives. Next, explanation of how each work is similar and different. Now, in research, you will see that some works all look the same, as I said, and some will look very different from each other. It is our job as a researcher to show how they are similar and how they are non-similar in nature. If you are able to find those differences by your review of literature, it means that you are actually thinking above the given. You don't just take in what it is, but you're able to critique a work and analyze it and contribute towards it. So that explanation of similarity and differences is important. What is interesting is many people will choose works that support their work. For example, I will choose literature review that supports my work area of study. I will never choose works that do not support my area of study. And that's actually a very it's not a very wise thing to do. If you have a very strong area of research and there are research articles that not necessarily agree with your area of research, it's good that you mention them in your literature review and justify through paraphrasing why you have established this particular research despite these works that don't necessarily agree with you. So that is very important. So this idea of accepting or writing only review of literature that agrees with us is a very biased way of doing literature review. We also have to juxtaposition our work with other reviews that don't necessarily support our area of study or contradict our area of study. Next is attempting at a conclusion. Now, this might not be possible all the time, but what you must do is, by your review of literature, you must try to prove that there is an existing gap in the body of research and you are going to address that research gap. Okay, moving on, ma'am, the next slide please, slide number 14. How do I choose my research articles? Do I randomly just download everything that I get? Do I just go to a library and photocopy everything that I get? How do I make a choice of the articles that I want for my review of literature? So the first one is provenance. Provenance is, look at the author. How relevant is the author to your study? Is he an expert in your field? Has he pioneered with some particular theory, some particular method, some particular way of teaching? Then choose that particular author. Is that author having a high citation? Go ahead with that author. So always go for a very highly cited work, because then it adds the leverage to your work. Next is methodology. Don't just choose an work because the title has a keyword that is in agreement with our title as well. Most of the time we type in keywords, and all the articles that come with that particular keyword we download. I'm not saying it's not right to download, but it's very important to choose from that what I want to integrate into my literature review. So what do I have to integrate into my literature review? Look at the methodology. What methodology has that particular researcher used? Is that methodology useful to me to finding out data? Is it something that I could integrate in my work and talk about it? Is it pivotal? Then yes. Okay, because every researcher will have different techniques, different methods. So look at it and look at how they have appropriated the data. Is it done ethically? Then mention it. Sometimes the methodology will help you to understand that the data that they have is probably not right. They're not ethically done. So then you can also refer to that as well. Next is objectivity. Sometimes you read some article, you will know that the author has already a decided response. And then the author has just channelized the entire article to go along with the given idea that he or she has fabricated. So they will have a very skewed vision in the entire article. If that is the case, don't go with that article. Always the article should frame by itself. The research work should frame by itself. It should be a consensus of the method, the framework, the theory, everything, and the result should be an objective produce. If that is the case, go with that article. If you feel that it is a very biased work, it's a very narrowed perspective, don't go with that article. Next is persuasiveness. Sometimes when you read the work, you feel, okay, this is not something that has exerted much work out of the researcher. This is a very casual work of the researcher. They've not done much. There is not much method, or they probably have spoken about the methodology, but when you look at the analysis, the methodology is not implemented. Sometimes you find that they talk about a theoretical framework, but the theoretical framework is nowhere in the research. It's just there, mentioned. If that's the case, then don't go with it. The theoretical framework, the analysis, the findings, they all should link one to the other. They should be a holistic combination of everything. Then go for those research articles. Next is value. I think I've already mentioned to you. Look at how relevant the author is. Look at how cited the author is, and then mention. Another thing is how recent the work is. Sometimes you might find the author is highly cited but not recent. Still go with it. Sometimes the author might not be very highly cited but is very relevant, very recent. Please go for it, because there are many times when you go for any conference or any Viva voce, and they'll ask, what was the last article that you read? What was the articles that you have integrated into your research that has happened over the last year? So those are very important. Most of the time we get a lot of data that is more than a decade ago, but we need to choose the most recent, the most better. Kartika ma'am, next slide please. This is how we can frame our literature review. So these are actually the steps that help us. First is the problem formulation, next is the literature search, third is data evaluation, for this analysis and interpretation. Actually, if you look at stages of literature review and the previous slide, they actually integrated one into the other. Okay, so how do I go about my literature review? Decide what your topic is. Decide what are the subcomponents of your topic, what are the variables of your research, what do you actually want to do. Decide upon that. Then you try to find your research articles that go along with your variables, with your theory, with your topic, with your area of research, etc. Then you need to review, read, and then come to a consensus of what you want to integrate and what you don't want to integrate. Okay, and what you can actually do is work with, the most important would be the methodology, the findings, and the theories. These would help you to decide whether you want that particular article or no. Okay, next slide, ma'am, please. Ways of organizing literature review. There are many ways of organizing literature review, but these are some of the most commonly used ways of organizing literature review. Sometimes if you look at the literature review, it will look like potpourri. It will look like everything has just been thrown in and they just have no order at all. So always your literature review has to have some method in madness. So even if you are going to do it according to our own way, when someone reads it, they should be able to understand, okay, there is a certain method that they have followed. So these are some of the methods in which review of literature is organized. Now, one is a chronological. That is how it has been published over a period of time. Not on how the events have happened, but how it has been published. Okay, for example, now let's say there is a particular research that happened in 1990 and then 2000, 2010, 2020. Those would be the chronology of events of a particular topic. Now, let's say we are talking about a research in a particular area. We will trace that particular research over a period of time, and whatever articles that have been covered over that period of time in that particular area, we will talk about. That is chronology of events. Next is by publication. This is something that most people do. We go from the most relevant, most important, most cited to the least. Okay, so your literature review can actually be a combination of one or two of this. You can follow the chronology of events, but go from the most recent to the least recent. Okay. Next is thematic. Thematic is something that we very often find, especially for qualitative research, wherein you have certain themes, certain ideas, certain topics, and you cluster your literature review for each of these topics and you put them down. This is actually a very safe way to go for literature review, because rather than breaking your head on the chronology of event or most recent to least recent, the thematic is a very safe way to go because you're organizing or talking about an idea. When you talk about thematic, you can also talk about answering your research objectives. It's a very easy way, a very convenient way even for the reviewer to understand. Next is methodology. Now, if your priority, and only if your priority, is understanding the methodology of a particular research, then concentrate on how that particular method was implemented in that particular given time. If it is not relevant to your study, please don't use it or waste your time in it. Next slide, ma'am, please. When you choose works for literature review, the first thing that you must look for is evidence. Okay, whatever that you read, is it backed up with evidence in those particular articles, in those particular chapters, whatever it is. If it is not backed up with evidence, you will not be able to have much to discuss about in your literature review. So that particular evidence is important for you as a researcher to talk about when you do your literature review. Next is be selective. Okay, you will find a lot of literature review that at that particular point of time everything will look important for you, but take some time, write down your literature review and then filter it. Okay, think of how you want to organize your literature review, what is your priority, what are your requirements, and then work with it. Quotes. Many of the times we see literature review with paragraphs and paragraphs of quotes. Sometimes they are box indexed, sometimes they are quoted, but they're full of quotes. I think it's a very convenient way when you don't want to paraphrase. So use quotes, but let that not become your literature review altogether. Quotes are only a part of your literature review. So I will actually tell you to use a very homogeneous mixture of summarizing, paraphrasing, and quoting. So, as per the requirement, I cannot say that you have to have this ratio. That would not be right. But as per the articles that you read, you will see that this particular work you can only summarize, you have nothing to contribute. Then just summarize. If you look at an article that is a little interesting where you want to say something about it, then paraphrase. Or if you feel that this is a particular quote that you can never replace, you can never rephrase, it's too precious, then quote. So prioritize on these three ranges and go for your literature review. Next is summarizing and synthesizing. Never imagine that if you just take works from an article and put it and probably run it through one of the AI that you have, it will give you something. And don't imagine that that could be considered as literature review, which happens very often. I have seen students submit literature review using ChatGPT, which is not very interesting to read. And then there are other platforms as well which students use to produce literature review. The interesting part is it does not know to recognize and rephrase authors. Okay, and sometimes it finds synonyms that are ridiculous. So please don't go for that. Use your own words. It's okay if you take time to write, to rewrite, to make mistakes. It's still your work. You'll still be proud of it. And it's only a matter of time when we engage in something unethical for people to point out and find out. So always do something that you're going to be proud of when you go back to. So use your own words. Even if it is wrong, it's okay. There will be people to correct you and help you out. Keeping your voice. As I said, sometimes people only quote, sometimes people only summarize, but literature review is not that. It's also about your voice. What do I have to say about it? That is very important. That's why I said choose articles that not necessarily agree with you. So you have something to say. Okay. And it's always good when you do literature review to choose 2 or 3 articles and put them together if they share something in common and then share your opinion about it. An example would be say Article A talks about probably benefits of online classes. Article B talks about benefits of online classes only for urban students. And Article C talks about the disadvantages of online classes for rural students. Put them together and then share your opinion about it. That becomes a very strong literature review. That's why I said keep your voice. Next is use caution. That is, most of the time we read something and we are so influenced by it, especially when it comes to literature review and other authors that are so well established. We read them over and over again, and in very simple terms, we become fans of them. And then we, at one particular point, we think their thoughts are our thoughts. It's like people who plagiarize movies. They watch a movie and then they remake it in a slightly different way. I think sometimes it's purposeful, sometimes it's unconscious. Literature review also happens that way. People read so many articles, and you read the article, and at one particular point of time, a thought of the author becomes our thought, and we think those are my thoughts, those are not our thoughts, those are the author's thoughts. So always learn to demarcate your own thoughts from the author's thoughts. The next slide, ma'am, please, slide 18. Always cite. It's okay if you quote, it's okay if you paraphrase. Even if we paraphrase, we have to cite. It doesn't mean that because I have not quoted or because I have not just taken a chunk of it and put it there, I need not cite. You have to cite, otherwise it will come under issues of plagiarism. Okay. You have to address the main components. Just summarizing will not work as literature review. 1 or 2 places it's okay, but you must be able to significantly identify the important points and mention them. Detecting a research gap is the sole purpose of a literature review. So if you're not able to identify a research gap, then rethink whether your literature review is really effective or no. Okay, this is very important. You have to be able to establish a need for your study through your literature review. Next is objectivity. Sometimes I have very biased opinions about something. And because probably, as I said, I might come from a community that needs something and I'm addressing that issue. And then I might have certain thoughts that I very persuasively want to address. But then objectivity has to be my priority. Okay. I've already mentioned that, not mentioning others' research as my research. And bias. Bias I already said. Sometimes I might have such strong emotions for a particular topic, but I cannot talk about it as my topic. Okay. Um, I think I'll stop with that because we are coming to the end of it. Um, we'll close the session. This last slide, literature analysis for review articles, these are some of the methods which I have seen being used for literature review. Not that, ma'am, the last slide. Um, no, I never took hypothesis framing. Slide number 90. 19. After this, I don't know how it is changing. All right. Wait, I'll try to find it. Slide number 90. Slide number 18, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm not doing hypothesis because that's a totally different topic. So, usually for literature review, these are some of the ways in which literature review is done. They either look at major concepts and they do their literature review based only on major concepts, or they do literature review only on methods used and their results, or they specifically look at articles that look at theories and investigate and analyze theories in the given area, or they look at instruments used, that is tools of research. Okay, and then they try to compare tools. Usually this comes when you have very recent tools and age old tools. For example, if you look at collecting data for words that are spoken today, you have so many tools that are very contemporary, and then you might probably juxtaposition it against tools that are probably not that recent. Then application. How was this particular research applied? Was it useful? What were the results? Who was the beneficiary of this research? Okay. And then you can also do literature review on the quantitative and qualitative aspects of the research. These you can use if you're looking at sending research articles purely as a review article. You can look at one of these methods and you can draft your research articles. Mostly these are the areas which people do review of literature articles to send for research. So that would be the end of my session. Thank you so much, Dr. Kartika, for having me. It's been a pleasure. Although it has been online, I think I felt very much at home to be a part of academia. And thank you so much to the organization, the management, the dean, and your particular school for organizing this. Especially, I think we have not abandoned the idea of online sessions, and I think it has come in use, especially to many of us who are working and researching, because we can still benefit what is being given by people like you through FDP, even when it is not possible for us to physically move. And thank you so much for having me. It has been a very comfortable, very happy experience. Thank you so much.
Yeah, indeed. It was a pleasure to have you here. And thank you so much, ma'am. And any questions, participants? Any questions? Ma'am, that was a mind-blowing session. Thank you so much for accepting our invite. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay. Participants, tomorrow at the same time, we'll meet you all. Thank you. Feedback form will be posted in group. Thank you so much.